All right. Well, hello, everyone. This is Rebecca Dallin, Assistant Superintendent for Stormwater Quality here at the City of Oklahoma City. I'd like to officially welcome everyone to the May edition of our 2022 monthly webinar series. We will begin the main presentations momentarily, so I want to provide some information to help enhance everyone's experience during the presentations today. In order to reduce background noise, we ask that everyone keep themselves muted during the presentations. If anyone has any questions during the presentations, please type them into chat. Chris Stewart and I will be monitoring chat for questions, and we'll have our guest speakers answer as many questions as we have time for today at the end of the program. If anyone would like to receive a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, please send Heavenly an email. And I'm going to put her information into chat at this time. So now you'll have her email address available that has been posted into chat. Each of the presentations in this webinar series will be available within a week or so after the scheduled webinar date on our website under Stormwater Workshops. The section where these webinars are posted is called the 2022 Webinar Series, and of course this will be the May edition. I'll post a link to that where you can find those presentations toward the end of today's program. If anyone has any questions at this time, feel free to type them into chat, but without further ado, I will begin a very short welcome presentation for our webinar series.
Good afternoon and welcome to our monthly Stormwater Quality webinar series. We're excited to continue providing monthly opportunities to learn how you can help keep our local waterways clean. Remember, we're all downstream from someone else, so we all need to work together to protect our waterways. During this series, you will have the opportunity to hear from some of our own stormwater quality staff, as well as several guest speakers. This month's presentation will feature 2 guest speakers from the Department of Environmental Quality. The webinar series continues with a feature in September discussing the utilization of compost for erosion control, additional topics from the DEQ, and topics from wastewater utilities in December. We hope to see you each month, so be sure to tune in. As we briefly mentioned, each of the presentations will be available online within a week or so after the presentation is aired live. It will be available on the workshop section of our Stormwater Quality website. I'll post a direct link to that page into chat toward the end of today's program. It seems that we're being rather ambitious this year since we've added virtual lunch and learns to the mix. You will need to register for each of these events separately. You can always reach out to Brooke for more information. She will be sending out a registration announcement closer to each event date. Some of the vendors sponsoring these events have new products and tools that you may not have heard of before, so please be sure to tune in to these presentations. You could learn something new which might help streamline your stormwater protection practices. As always, anytime we provide information regarding specific vendors or products, it is not to be considered an endorsement. We provide the information to help you in your research to determine the best products and services that will benefit your own stormwater program. We have recorded each session thus far, and if anyone would like to view the recording of a past session, please send Brooke or I an email so we can send you the Dropbox link. They are not located on our Oklahoma City website. Some of our presentations will be live and some will be pre-recorded. We do our best to provide as much detailed, accurate information as possible, while also working with the presenter's strengths and their schedule. We live and work in a beautiful community here in Oklahoma City. For more information about stormwater, what we're up to, and local regulations, be sure to visit our website.
All right, up next will be the main presentations for today's webinar. Today we're going to hear from 2 guest speakers from the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality's Water Quality Division. First up will be Michael Moe. Michael is a professional engineer. He possesses over 30 years of engineering experience, including over 25 years in the water quality field. He grew up in Oklahoma City, graduating from Putnam City North High School. He earned his Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Rice University in Houston, Texas, and his MS in Chemical Engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. After graduating, he worked as a laboratory QA manager for a specialty gas company, where he set up and ran their analytical laboratory. He joined the Oklahoma Water Resources Board as an industrial wastewater permit writer in 1992 and was transferred to the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality, DEQ, upon its formation in 1993. While there, he earned his professional engineer license in 1996 and rose to the position of manager of the Industrial Wastewater Permits section. Leaving DEQ in 1999, he joined the consulting firm SAIC and later Leidos when it was spun off, where he worked as an engineer and project manager, providing regulatory, permitting, and compliance support to EPA headquarters, several EPA regional offices, and state environmental agencies, as well as some commercial customers. He rejoined DEQ in 2014, where he served as engineering manager for the wastewater group for 5.5 years. He currently serves a dual role as municipal wastewater discharge and stormwater permit section manager and technical projects manager. Up next will be Steve Reed. Steve is an engineering intern at DEQ. He grew up in Oklahoma City and graduated from Bishop McGinnis High School. After graduating from the University of Oklahoma with degrees in mathematics and mechanical engineering, he worked as a project engineer with 3M in Weatherford, Oklahoma. He joined the Peace Corps and taught mathematics and science at a rural school in Ghana, West Africa. Upon returning to the United States, he obtained certification to teach mathematics in Oklahoma. After teaching for 20 years, he returned to engineering work at the Department of Environmental Quality in the Industrial Wastewater Inspection and Enforcement section. Again, if anyone has any questions, please be sure to type them into chat. We will reserve questions until the end of both presentations. All right, Mike, please go ahead and share your screen and begin your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. And can everybody see my slide now?
Yes, it has loaded.
Okay. Yeah, as Rebecca mentioned, my name is Mike Moe. I manage the municipal and stormwater permit section here at DEQ. And today I'm going to be talking about our 2022 OKR05 industrial stormwater multi-sector general permit renewal. I will give kind of a, touch on at least an overview of the permit as a whole, but given our limited time, my primary focus will be on the changes from the current or 2017 OKR05 permit. Before I get into the permit itself, I thought I would take a minute to talk about the renewal status. Our current general permit issued in 2017 expires on July 5th, 2022, so it's coming up pretty quickly. That permit currently covers more than 1,600 facilities in 29 industrial sectors. Our 2022 OKR05 permit renewal, EPA completed their review in February. They did have some comments on the permit, but no substantive changes were made as a result of those comments. The permit then went to public notice, and the public comment period closed on April 14th. We did receive some comments from the public and are proposing some minor changes to the final permit. Currently, our response to comments on final permit are in internal review with senior management at the moment, and we believe we're on track for the renewal permit to be issued and effective by the expiration of the current permit. So there should not be any gap in permit coverage. This just shows the 29 industrial sectors that are covered. I know it's small print, so don't expect you to read it all, and I'm certainly not going to read it all, but it will be available as part of the presentation for you to look at later. There's also a 30th sector, which is kind of a catch-all for facilities that aren't specifically covered in other sectors, but that we believe should be covered and would thus be designated by the director on an individual facility basis. The 2022 OKR05 general permit, there are 10 major sections. We have reorganized the section somewhat from the 2017 permit, just to what we hope is a more a little more logical flow. There are also 4 appendices, and I'll be getting into each of those in a moment, each of these parts in a moment. Part 1 is eligibility, coverage, and application. This basically lays out who needs to be covered under this permit, what are the allowable types of discharges for stormwater and some non-stormwater, areas of coverage where EPA or ODAF is the permitting authority, and then a bit about the types of facilities and activities covered, as well as co-located activities or facilities, and limitations on coverage. It also covers how to go about applying for and obtaining an authorization, and some conditions, to exclusion, how to terminate coverage, and so forth. So changes from the 2017 permit and the 2022 permit, we've combined parts 1 and 2 of the previous permit. In part 1.3, allowable non-stormwater discharges, we've done some reorganization, consolidated some of the similar discharges and tried to clarify that a bit more. Part 1.5, areas of coverage, we've tried to clarify EPA versus DEQ jurisdiction a bit better than it was in the previous permit. We've added a new section, part 1.8, for co-located industrial facilities. That would be facilities, that are, independent facilities, but they're located on common property, like potentially like an industrial park. Those facilities are required to submit separate NOIs and receive their own authorization, but they may work together to develop a joint stormwater pollution prevention plan, or SWP3. We also have a new requirement to post assign a permit coverage, which just must have some basic information like the OPDS permit number and facility contact for stormwater. And that's similar to signage requirements we have in some of our other permits. Part 1.10, obtaining an authorization. There are several changes, some new things here. First off, in the previous permit, some facilities, depending on where they were located, had to submit their SWIP to DEQ for review. That is no longer the case. Now, SWIPs are not required to be submitted to DEQ unless they're specifically requested. So you would just keep them, on file at the facility and make them available to our inspectors and so forth. A couple of things have been added to the notice of intent. We now ask for a general location map and a site map of the facility, and application fees have to be paid at the time of NOI submittal before we can accept the NOI as complete and process it and issue the authorization. We are going to be moving to an online NOI submittal system that's currently undergoing testing. If anybody would like to help out with that, you can contact Misty Johnson in our ECLS section through this email or phone number. We believe we are currently on track for deployment of that online NOI system upon, with the permit renewal when the permit goes into effect. And we don't have details yet, but I'm sure we will be providing some outreach and training on how to use that new system. Part 2 covers control measures and effluent limits. It includes selection and design criteria, technology-based limits, incorporates some of the federal effluent limitation guidelines, include numeric effluent limits for some stormwater discharges, and so those are incorporated into this permit. We also it also covers water quality-based limits, requiring compliance with water quality standards, has language covering discharges to impaired water bodies, and anti-degradation requirements for new or increased discharges. And then it also covers endangered species and historic preservation requirements. So changes to this section, part 2.1.1, control measures and design considerations. Permittees must, among the considerations for control measures and design, permittees must now consider risks and impacts from major storm events that could cause extreme flooding, and hopefully establish some BMPs, or control measures, other control measures specifically to address that. We've also expanded and provided some examples of potential pollution prevention and mitigation measures. Under part 2.1.2.6, management of runoff, we have again added some examples of different structural BMPs for runoff management, and added some links to various internet-based resources on BMPs. Part 2.1.2.10, employee training. We've revised the scope of personnel training somewhat to incorporate relevant items to cover the aspects of this SWP3 requirements under this permit. Part 3.1 covers inspections, procedures, and documentations, with exceptions for inactive or unstaffed sites. But the only significant change we've made here is in part 3.1, routine facility inspections. The scope has been revised to specify potential sources of pollution and items that must be examined during an inspection. That's really more kind of a clarification and explanation than really a new requirement. Part 4 covers monitoring requirements, including options for commingled discharges, definition of measurable storm events, sample types, monitoring periods, exceptions for adverse weather conditions, and so forth. And there are 4 types of monitoring required under part 4.2. Those include quarterly visual monitoring, effluent limitations monitoring for those facilities that are subject to numerical effluent limits, and monitoring of discharges to impaired waters, both whether before or after a TMDL has been established. And then there is a potential for DEQ to establish other monitoring requirements on a case-by-case or facility-specific basis if we deem them needed. Then part 4.15, changes in this part, sample types. We specify that samples should be grab samples, but we do allow for the use of auto samplers or passive samplers if appropriate. Part 4.2.2.2.3 lays out follow-up actions if the discharge exceeds any numeric effluent limitations. Specifies corrective actions that have to be taken. There's an exceedance report that has to be submitted. And then, if you have an exceedance, you have to do follow-up monitoring within 30 days, and then quarterly thereafter until you come back into compliance with the numeric limit. And also, you must investigate the cause of the exceedance and take corrective action, and document that and modify the SWIP as necessary. Part 4.2.3, impaired waters monitoring. There's always been a lot of questions or uncertainty, both among the regulated community and even somewhat within in-house here at the agency as to what the purpose for that monitoring was. So we have tried to clarify that in the new permit. We also specify that that impaired waters monitoring data doesn't have to be submitted to DEQ unless we request it, but the facilities should use it as screening data to evaluate their BMP effectiveness. And then the question came up during public comment period. Any discharge to impaired waters is considered to happen if the facility is located within 1 mile of an impaired water. Question came up during the public comments about how that would apply to facilities that discharge into an MS4 or other separate storm sewer system. So we have added a little language to clarify that. Okay, Part 5, corrective actions. Lays out conditions under which you're required to review and revise your SWIP, as well as laying out corrective actions and deadlines for performing those actions. But the only changes here in this section are that corrective action language has been revised to require the permittee or clarified that the permittee must immediately, which basically means the same or the following day, investigate the causes of the issue, and then take all reasonable steps necessary to minimize or prevent the discharge of pollutants until a permanent solution can be put into place. Part 6 is the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan, lays out the requirements, contents, and requirements for availability of the SWIP. Changes here. This is probably the most extensively revised section of the general permit, although here still a lot of the changes are, to clarify or provide additional examples. But in part 6.1, SWIP requirements requires that the SWIP must be prepared by a qualified person, which is defined in the permit definition section of the permit, and they must have conducted a site visit to assess the facility's activities. We want to make sure it's being prepared by someone who's familiar with the facility. For new facilities, that are haven't started operating yet, then the site visit must be conducted within 1 year of completing construction. Part 6.2.2, facility and site description. We've added a couple of requirements to include, list the regular business hours and SWIP preparer contact info. And there are also to identify in the site map to identify areas of existing or potential soil erosion. Whoops. Part 6.2.3.1, industrial activities. We've just provided some expanded examples of types of industrial activities that could be exposed to stormwater. Part 6.2.3.5, investigation of unauthorized non-stormwater discharges. We've clarified that you must inspect the entire facility for the presence of such unauthorized discharges. Then part 6.2.5, stormwater controls to meet effluent limits. Here we've expanded the description to try to make the requirements more clear, specific, and understandable, with additional examples and so forth. Part 6.2.6.4, monitoring. There are some additional documentation requirements now to identify the person responsible for sampling, describe your procedures for sample collection and handling, and procedures for sending your samples to a certified lab if you are using one. Part 6.2.6.6, employee training. We've laid out some specific requirements for training plan documentation and added a requirement to provide just some really basic training to general staff who may not be involved with the industrial activities or the stormwater issues on a day-to-day basis, but we do want them to at least receive some training to be familiar with the basic goals of the SWIP and how to contact someone on the stormwater pollution prevention team if they see a problem. Part 6.2.9, SWIP review and modifications. We now require that the SWIP be reviewed at least annually and then modified as needed. So, that does reinforce the intent that the SWIP should be a living document rather than just something that's put together and then put on the shelf. Part 7 covers reporting and record keeping. Just a small change here. We've revised the ACER form, the annual report form, to incorporate new requirements that have been established in this permit. Part 8, that's standard permit conditions that apply to all permits. So no substantive changes here. Part 9, definitions. We've revised and tried to clarify some of the existing definitions. We've also established new definitions for base flood elevation. That goes with trying to evaluate the potential impact of major storm events. Define co-located industrial facilities, and provided a definition of green infrastructure, which in the previous permit talked some about green infrastructure but didn't really define it anywhere. So that's just something that we try to encourage, is that look at opportunities to use green infrastructure. Section 10, that lays out the sector-specific requirements for all those 29 sectors. We have reorganized them slightly within some of the sectors, and Sector L for landfills. We added some language to clarify the requirements for closed landfills. Basically, if landfill closure has been approved by our Land Protection Division, then coverage under this permit is no longer required. But if if the landfill has been closed but hasn't received approval of the closure yet from Land Protection, then it would still be subject to being would still have to be covered under this permit as an inactive landfill. Other than that, we didn't really make any substantive changes to this part. The appendices, couple things. The previous permit included the NOI, NOT, and other forms as appendices. We have removed those from the permit this time around. They will be available separately. We will have an online NOI form. Other forms will be up on our website. That makes it a little easier, more straightforward. If we find that we need to make changes to some of those forms, makes it a lot easier to do that. We don't have to do it as a modification of the whole permit. Appendix A covers outstanding resource waters, sensitive waters, and endangered species. We haven't made any substantive changes there. Now Appendix B is spill prevention and response procedures checklist. Again, no substantive changes. Appendix C, we've provided an example of signage to go along with the new signage requirement. And then Appendix D, we've added a list of web links or URLs for relevant agencies and regulatory citations that are used throughout the permit to make it easier for people who can't use. We do have some hyperlinks embedded in the permit But for people who only have a paper copy or or can't use the hyperlinks, then those links are also laid out in this appendix. So that covers the proposed 2022 Stormwater General Permit and proposed changes. And I will now turn it over to Steve to talk a bit about inspections and compliance. And
Okay, thank you so much, Mike. A lot of good stuff in there. And can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to mute myself and let you take it away, Steve. Let me know when you'd like me to forward the slides.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. All right, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm with the inspection and enforcement section at Water Quality, and I want to talk a little bit about both the inspections that should be done by the facility and the inspection that DEQ performs. Next. So here are the objectives that I have here. So I want to talk about what to expect during a routine inspection, although it's very similar if we're out doing an inspection based on a complaint or a referral. Some of the records that the permit requires you to keep that we would go through. Talk a little bit about some of the exceptions, things that would allow you to not do certain things that we might see. And then talk a little bit about the enforcement procedure. And then I have some slides with some pictures of some things that we might see during an inspection. Next. So a very important part of stormwater control are the non-structural and structural components. So examples of those non-structural components would be good housekeeping. So during an inspection, we're going to look for evidence that the people at the facility are maintaining the property. We'll check records for the training that's been done to make sure that that's being done on a frequency required by the permit. We'll look to see that any material at the site has minimum exposure to the elements, and that they have a spill prevention program that not only that they have that, but that's been included in the training. Then active structural controls, things that could be used by the facility to prevent erosion. We'll check to see the effectiveness of that. The facility should be doing inspections to see that that's being done, but we'll go out and verify those things. So typically that might be a filter berm, a sediment basin that contains the stormwater and gives it time for any sediment to settle out, rock dams that would slow down the velocity of the stormwater to help prevent erosion, and then vegetation. Next. So as Mike mentioned, there are some components of the permit that require the facility to perform inspections, and this is expected to be done on a routine basis. That there are some sectors that have additional inspections that are required. Every authorization requires that a quarterly visual monitoring inspection be done, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And in certain cases, for example, if the facility is located near an impaired water body, that there may be a more than just a visual monitoring, but a sample taken and analysis done by a DEQ certified laboratory. And if that annual monitoring is required, then a discharge monitoring report is required to be submitted to DEQ. Any of these samplings or inspections that's performed at the facility should be done by a trained person. So we want to make sure that when that water sample is being collected, that it's following the proper procedure. Next. So as part of the routine inspection, these are some of the things that they should be checking. Any material or chemical storage should be inspected to make sure that there aren't problems with material leaking and being exposed to stormwater. On-site containers, including waste containers, should be inspected, and we'll make sure that the containers are covered to make sure that there's no debris that might be leaving those containers and ending up on site or in bodies of water. The inspection should include the stormwater control measures, or the BMPs, the best management practices. A walk of the perimeter should be done, including the stormwater outfalls. Those stormwater outfalls should be marked on the site map that's part of the SWIP. And since the SWIP is a living document, if those outfalls change, if there's an outfall that no longer has water leaving, or if there's maybe due to construction, there's another location where stormwater is leaving the facility, then that should be added to the map on the SWIP. The routine inspection should be done at least quarterly, and occasionally that frequency is increased depending upon the sector that the facility belongs to. Next. So when performing the quarterly visual monitoring report, the sampling needs to be done after a qualifying event, which is defined as a rain event of greater than 1/10 of an inch, and it has to be at least 72 hours after the last qualifying event. This kind of minimizes the sampling that's required if a rain event occurred within several days of the last event, then we don't really expect to see much in the way of sediment or pollutants. The sampling should be done during daylight and normal working hours. So I've been to facilities that said that if it's raining, they just shut down. So if that's part of their facility, then they wouldn't be required to do that quarterly visual monitoring. We want the inspectors to be doing this safely. And so if they're doing it at night, or if there's adverse conditions, then safety of the workers, very important. So we don't require the monitoring to be done during that. All of the stormwater outfall should be observed, and the sample should be collected within 30 minutes. So we're looking for evidence of pollution that might be going off of the facility, and so that's going to occur primarily in the first 30 minutes of the qualifying rain event. I'll go into more detail of the things that are expected to be observed on the next slide. So next. So quarterly visual monitoring. So it's actually looking at all of the senses when we're looking at the water sample. So when you collect the water sample, you need to make sure that it's a clear bottle, that you're not scraping the ground when you're collecting the water sample. We don't want sediment from the ground collected in the sample. And you can see here the parameter that we're looking at, the method that's used for testing it, and then examples of results that you might be looking for there. For example, smelling the water sample to see if there's any detectable odors that might indicate that there's some sort of a problem. Solids are important, floating, settled, or suspended solids. So you look on top of the water sample, in the water sample itself, or any sediment that might have settled to the bottom. Next. So the permit does specify any additional monitoring. For example, Sector T is um, wastewater treatment plant. And so it'll specify additional areas that may not be present at other facilities, such as sludge piles, treatment units, et cetera. And then the permit will say which sectors are required to do that annual numerical sampling, where you have to send it off to a lab. And here are some examples of that. So anybody that's near an impaired stream, any water body that's been designated as sensitive water, if there's a stream that has a total maximum daily load plan, and there are typical pollutants that that are found in these areas might be suspended solids, there might be requirements for pH, dissolved oxygen, and so on. And as I mentioned before, if you do that sampling, you have to submit a discharge monitoring report to DEQ. Next. So during the facility inspection, then if there's a problem that's found, so if the water is observed to have an odor or sediment or something, then the permit asks the facility to notify DEQ and to take immediate corrective action and then report on what steps have been taken. And then not just to try to fix the problem, but to do a follow-up to see whether or not the corrective action has been effective or not. Next. So if DEQ comes out, whether it's a referral or a complaint or just a routine inspection, then this is what you might expect to happen. So we'll ask to see the SWIP and make sure that that's up to date, looking to see any changes that have been made, and we'll look at the documentation of the inspections that have been performed by the facility. So whatever the frequency is that's required by the permit, whether it's monthly or quarterly, we'll make sure that those inspections are being done. The quarterly visual monitoring report, see if those are being done. And I should have noted that it's possible to go a quarter without having a qualifying rain event, in which case you still need to document that you recognize that there were no qualifying rain events, and the documentation that for that quarter will just show that there was no qualifying event during that time. So copies of the inspection reports, if there were problems found, the corrective action reports and the steps that were taken to try to fix those problems. If the annual lab analysis is required, then we'll be looking that the analysis was done by a DEQ certified lab. We'll check the chain of custody to make sure that the integrity of the sample has been maintained, and that the facility should keep a copy of that discharge monitoring report that was submitted. The annual report is basically a compilation of those quarterly reports, and that's to be submitted to DEQ. So for last year, that report was due by March 1st of this year. And all of those records, the inspection reports, the lab reports, the ACER, all of those should be retained on site for 3 years. Next. So there are some water activities that are not required to be permitted. Discharges from emergency operations or firefighting activities. If a fire hydrant at the facility is being flushed, if the landscape is being watered, or there are some other things that are specified there. And so these are things that don't require a permit. Although in the example of firefighting, even though that doesn't require a permit, we do ask that the facility take steps to minimize the impact of the water flowing off the facility, setting up um, check dams or filter berms, things like that. In the event that there are substantially identical stormwater outfalls, you're not required to sample from both of those outfalls. What I like to see is, for example, if there are two outfalls in the same parking lots, you expect the results of a sampling to show the same results. You only need to sample one of those. We do like to see that you alternate. So if there are two outfalls that are substantially identical, that you indicate that on your SWIP, on your facility map, and then you alternate between those. If you do have substantially identical outfalls, then you need to justify that, and DEQ needs to approve that. And the last item there, if you are required to do the annual testing by a lab, then you need to do that at each of your outfalls, even if they're considered substantially identical. Next. So I mentioned this earlier. If there are dangerous conditions, lightning, flooding, then you don't need to do the sampling during that time. You just need to document what was going on and why a sample wasn't obtained, and then mark the quarterly report as no discharge if there was no qualifying event. Now, it's possible that your facility might not need a stormwater permit if you can demonstrate that there are no possibility of pollution coming off of your facility during a precipitation event. Then you can get a no exposure certification. It's kind of tough to get that. You have to, there will be an inspection done of your facility if you request the NEC. And it's a zero tolerance policy on that. So if you have any exposure to stormwater, then you won't get that. And then that has to be renewed every time the permit comes up for renewal. If it's found that there's something that would disqualify that no exposure certification, then we'll revoke that, and then all the rules of the permit will be required. Next. So both my section, the industrial and stormwater field inspection enforcement section, and ECLS may do these inspections. I mentioned before that these inspections are done either as a result of a citizen complaint, a referral from another agency, or from program initiatives. I've talked about the things that the inspector is going to do when they show up. Next. So, I mean, we are the inspection/enforcement unit, but our goal is not to have to go through any enforcement or to find the facility. So our primary goal is to just have compliance with all of the rules and regulations. And as a result of that, we're more than happy to provide technical assistance. So if a facility isn't sure if they have all the requirements or if there are problems with achieving compliance, then they can ask for help on those things. In the event that there is enforcement that takes place, typically this is the procedure that'll be followed. If we go out and do an inspection, you'll get a warning letter and giving you a period of time to comply with whatever the issue is. If there's a violation of the regulations, then we'll issue a notice of violation. So you'll receive the letter, and it'll tell you exactly what the issue is and give you a time to comply. If things aren't brought into compliance, then it may go to a consent order, and those consent orders may contain an administrative penalty or monetary penalty, depending on the severity of the problem. Next. So we have districts. So if a complaint comes in, then the inspection and follow-up to that will be done by the district engineer. This map is mostly accurate, except in the northwest part of the state where Brandon Tyler is listed. He's been promoted to management, and so that district is open right now. So if you have a facility in those areas, then either your ECLS rep or the district engineer listed here would be your primary point of contact. If you're in Brandon's section, then you can call our office or any of the other engineers, and we'll help you in whatever way we can. And I think that's it. Oh, we got the pictures. Okay, next. Next. So this facility has done a very good job. They've got coverage over the barrels to minimize the exposure to stormwater. They've got things organized on pallets so that if there is water that gets in there, they're not exposing those barrels. Organized, it's labeled. So this is something we really like to see. Next. So if you have barrels of raw materials or finished product, or if you have a storage tank on site, you might have fuel for equipment on your site. Those hoses can drip out onto the ground, and that can wash away and get into waters of the state. And so we like to see a bucket or some way to contain that, and then any fluids that come out of those hoses then can be disposed of properly. Next. So here we see some secondary containment. Fuel tank or tanks with lubricants might have secondary containment that if there is a leak that it's contained. If you have a tank, if it's double walled, then the secondary containment isn't required. Next. Okay, some things that we don't like to see. So here's a used barrel. It does have a label on it, but you can see the remnants of the contents of the barrel on the outside. If this is outside, then you're going to have some of that material washing off into the property or into the waters of the state. Next. So any debris, any rubbish that's in there, if most of those containers are going to have an outlet, you can see down at the lower right-hand corner there, it looks like there's a place where water that's gotten in there has come out. It might be a place for the water to drain. And so any contamination that might be on those materials or any trash that might be in there can blow out or wash off. And so we would ask that this be covered to minimize the precipitation that might get into it and minimize the wind blowing it out of the container. Next. Okay, and here's, so it's disorganized. Some of the barrels don't look to be labeled. There's debris on the outside that could cause contamination. So they just need to get organized, get them off the ground, possibly try to get them covered. Next. So when we see standing water at a facility, we look for evidence of a sheen on the water or other pollutants that might be there. The area next to the water looks like it's got some contamination, and there's a lot of trash and debris that's in there. And so if a big gully washer comes through, it can spread that pollution off the site. So we'd ask the facility to find out what the source of that contamination is and come up with steps to mitigate that. Next. A lot of facilities have equipment on site. Sometimes it's not used frequently, and oftentimes we see fluids from the equipment that leak out. We'd ask the facility to put a collection pan underneath that so that those things don't get washed off. Next. So there's no water here, but there's clearly evidence that something is coming off of the concrete pad up there or out of the building that's washing onto the ground. We see evidence of erosion and the sediment there, and the path that the water's taking. It's obvious that there's something that's collecting there. Next. So going further downstream, there's water here, and we see evidence from the vegetation that it's having an impact there, along with the erosion. Next. So we wouldn't typically see this at an industrial site. This is something we'd see more often at a construction site. We have a hose with who knows what is being put into the drain. Typically, these drains go straight to a river, and so whatever is in the hose there is going to just go straight into the river. We see evidence of some contamination there, the white debris that's on the curb and the street there. So it looks like they're washing something out that's going straight into the drain. And we also see next between the fire hydrant and the grate there, looks like there's damage to the vegetation. And so we would, especially in the spring, summer, or fall, when you see that there's green vegetation there, so there's evidence that something is causing the vegetation to die. Next. Okay, so that's it. So Rebecca, did we get any questions in the chat for Mike or I?
Okay. Yes, and great presentation also, Steve. Thank you both. I mentioned that the online NOI system works great. I was one of the people that got to test it, so I would definitely recommend reaching out to Misty Johnson if you'd also like to test it. It's kind of cool, and you get to work through some of the what do I do things a little bit early. And then we had a question from Harold. Harold says, I just received my permit in March of this year. Sounds like they have a fairly new facility. So he says, will I need to submit a new NOI in July?
Yes. Authorizations under general permits do not carry over from one permit cycle to the next. So you will need to submit a new notice of intent. Unfortunately, it's just kind of the way it is. Some people kind of get caught with, unfortunate timing at the end of a permit cycle. But for renewals, you have 90 days from the effective date of the new permit to, to submit a new NOI for coverage under the new permit. And then your coverage under your current coverage under the existing permit will be administratively continued, So you would continue to be covered until your new authorization is issued.
Okay, and that is all the questions that we have today. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to reach out to myself or Brooke or Chris. We'll get those questions to Michael and Steve and get those responses back to you. I did post into chat that as a reminder, if anyone would like to receive a certificate of attendance for today's webinar, do email Heavenly. Her email is in chat, Heavenly Mendenhall. I've also posted the link to our website where this presentation recording will be posted here in just a few days, or it just depends on when our public information officer is available. We'll get that up there just as soon as possible. So thanks again for attending today. I hope everyone enjoyed the presentation. We hope to see you next month on June 15th at 1 p.m. We'll be hearing from Chris Stewart, and he'll be covering what to expect in Oklahoma City industrial stormwater inspection. So be a good transition. Anyway, thanks again. Hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good job, guys.